Glaciers, they're large rivers of ice and they play a huge role in how the earth functions and they're constantly changing right now, especially in wake of climate change. But what are glaciers in the first place and how have they changed over the course of earth's history and how will they change in the future and what impact will they have on our future and on our actively changing planet? Well, in this episode, I'm going to be speaking with Neosha Narayanan. Neosha studies glaciers and ice sheets at Georgia Tech and knows a lot about how these glaciers have been changing over time and how they will be in the future, and explain more about climate change and some of the problems glaciers and ice sheets are facing. Get ready for this cool episode, so grab your winter gear and let's go. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to have you on Spectacular Science.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
All right, let's get right into it. But first, can you please introduce yourself to the listeners?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Neosha. Um, I use they and she pronouns. I am a graduate student pursuing my PhD in glaciology at Georgia Tech. I have a bachelor's degree in MIT in material science and engineering, and I also have a master's in geophysics from MIT. And now I study glaciers for a living, which is super exciting.
Awesome, and we'll get more into that later in the episode. But first, how did you get interested in science?
I think I've always been interested in science from an early age. I grew up in Western Massachusetts, and I used to walk my dog in the woods every day. And so I've always really liked nature, and especially like the ecosystems around us. Because I was walking in the forest every day, I was fascinated by all the trees and the different plants that work together to create this beautiful ecosystem. And then in middle school and high school, I started learning about climate change. And I learned that a lot of these ecosystems and the nature that I loved so much is under threat worldwide because of climate change. And I think even though I had really liked science before that, that kind of made me really want to specifically study something related to the environment, because climate change is this big issue that it's really difficult to tackle and difficult to understand. And so that is how I started getting specifically into environmental science.
That's awesome, and we'll get into more detail about the glacier part later in this episode. But first, what are glaciers for people who don't know, and why are they important to the Earth?
Yeah, that's a great question. So glaciers are a very unique type of mass. So glaciers are ice, a huge mass of ice that basically gets squished under its own weight. So that's essentially what a glacier is. And how it forms is that you have snow, and then you have snow that accumulates on top of it. And then that snow is so heavy on top that it compresses the snow that's down below it. And when you compress snow really, really, really hard, it becomes ice. And then that ice gets big enough, it starts to flow because it's being pushed down by its own weight. And so that's what people mean when they say that glaciers flow, because they actually are kind of moving because they're being compressed and like pushed under their own weight. And what was the second part of the question?
Second part
Sorry.
question was, why are they important to Earth?
Ah, yeah, so glaciers are really important for a lot of reasons. So ice is just made out of ice, and snow comes from water, obviously. Um, and so glaciers hold a lot of water inside them, and that's frozen up as ice. So one of the most important things that glaciers do is that they're a water source for people who need water. So for example, in the Andes in South America and in the Himalayas in South Asia, um, glaciers are really important sources of water for people who live around them. So a lot of these humongous river systems in these areas are actually fed by the glaciers, because every summer the glaciers will melt a little bit, and that meltwater goes into these rivers that help people with agriculture and whatever else, drinking water, whatever you need water for. And they're also really important because sometimes when there's droughts, when it doesn't rain enough, at least glacier melt is more predictable than rain. And so the fact that that glacier melt is so constant, even though sometimes rain can be a little unpredictable, you could have a especially dry year. that glacier melt helps ensure that there's a steady flow of water so that people can survive until the next year um, without running out of water. So that's one reason why glaciers are really important. Another reason why glaciers are really important is because of this thing that we call sea level rise. So in Antarctica and Greenland, these are the largest ice masses in the world. There's so much water frozen up in those ice sheets that it actually takes water out of the ocean, and that's what keeps sea level stabilized. And that's what keeps our coasts in the same places. So we're probably going to talk about climate change a lot in this podcast because it's about glaciers. But when those ice sheets melt, it puts more of that water that used to be in the ice sheet into the ocean. And then the ocean rises as a result of that. And that can have enormous problems for people who live on coasts. So those are the two main reasons why glaciers are important, but I have a third one as well, which is that they are very important for changing landscapes. So if you've ever heard of like a U-shaped valley, for example, a lot of these have been carved by glaciers. And I'm from Massachusetts, and so if you ever look at a map of Massachusetts and you see Cape Cod is actually shaped that way because there used to be a huge glacier there.
Oh, wow.
And all of Cape Cod is basically like a glacier moraine. So and that's another reason why glacier is important is because they can really shape landscapes as well.
Yeah, when they flow, they start picking up things from the landscape, right? And eventually it starts carving out these entire valleys. And Cape Cod is a good example that you said of the impact that glaciers have on Earth. That's one of the few impacts that you described. But the big impact that you described was as a result of climate change. So that's a good segue into the next question, which is how has the amount of ice on Earth changed over time?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. So the Earth's climate fluctuates over time very, very slowly. And that's due to the orbit of the Earth kind of changes a little bit over time. And so over thousands and millions of years, we can get these slow fluctuations in climate. And ice needs cold to exist, otherwise it will melt. And so the ice sheets and glaciers of the world have also changed very slowly as the climate changes as well. And we can actually track that by using dating techniques to look at different rocks that were exposed at different times from the glaciers. And so they have been changing over time. So for one example is that 20,000 years ago, there was a huge ice sheet that used to cover most of all of Canada and most of the US. And now that's not there anymore. And we really only have ice at the poles and at certain very high altitudes, like in the Rockies, or in like tall mountains. Um, and the reason why glacier scientists like myself are so alarmed now is that the change in the rate of these glaciers melting has changed a lot in the last couple of centuries. So normally, the way the Earth works is that these glaciers will form and also melt over several tens of thousands of years. But in the last 200 years or so, the glaciers have started melting extremely quickly. And we are basically 100% sure that that's due to human climate change. So that's an unfortunate thing that we're losing our glaciers really fast, and it's at a rate that is completely unprecedented in the history of the Earth.
So are there any natural causes of glaciers melting? Like we know that the ice ages happened, so why isn't the entire Earth covered in glaciers and ice sheets anymore?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have like what climate scientists call our ice ages. So you might have seen the movie Ice Age. So that movie takes place during an ice age. And that's a time when the Earth's climate naturally became quite cold. And then gradually, very gradually, because the orbits of the Earth is changing, so basically like where the Earth is closest to the sun kind of changes over time. Um, that gravitational physics changes very slowly. The Earth slowly started to warm up, and that's why the glaciers have gradually disappeared since the last ice age. And we call the period when the Earth isn't covered with ice an interglacial. So there have been a lot of cycles of glacials and interglacials, and we're currently in a interglacial right now.
But what we're most concerned about is the speeding up of that gradual natural process, which is
Exactly.
climate change, and that causes global warming as a result. So how does climate change tie into glaciers and ice sheets? And why is it important to study this?
Yeah, that's also another good question. So glaciers are very much linked with climate change in a lot of ways. So obviously, when the climate gets warmer, glaciers will melt faster than they normally do. And one way that this affects climate is actually through ocean circulation, which I think you might have done a previous podcast
Mhm.
on ocean circulation before
Yep.
and how they affect weather. So glaciers are also a big part of this. So in the Atlantic Ocean, there's a system called which we call the AMOC, and that stands for the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. And so basically that kind of modulates the weather that happens in the Americas and also Africa and Europe. And so all of the weather in these areas is affected by this. And the way it gets fueled is through meltwater from Greenland. So the Greenland ice sheet, every summer it melts a little. And that cold, fresh water goes down into the ocean. And then that causes this massive current system, which controls the weather in all these areas. So if the Greenland ice sheet starts melting too fast, or if it starts disappearing, that pump might start to slow down, and we might see different weather and unstable weather across the Atlantic Ocean. So that's like one way that the climate is changing in response to the glaciers disappearing. And just generally, yeah, like I said, like the the warming of the climate really results in the disappearance of these glaciers, and that has effects on human beings and on ecosystems across the world.
So everything is basically tied together by something you wouldn't really think of, which is glaciers and ice sheets. It's especially relevant now because we're starting to see cities that are sinking because of all of this extra water that's coming from these glaciers melting. So why is it basically important to study this entire thing, and why is it important to keep track of all these changes in glaciers and ice sheets over time?
Yeah, so I think personally, the reason why I think studying glaciers is important is because there's not only an impact on ecosystems across the world, but there's also an impact on human beings. So, for example, the country of Tuvalu in the Pacific has already lost a lot of its landmass, and they're projected to be the first country to be completely lost to sea level rise. And
Wow.
that's really sad because it's a whole country full of people and culture that is going to be lost because of climate change. And we also see that there's so many coastal communities across the world. Like a huge portion of the world's population lives very, very close to the coast, and all of those people will be affected by sea level rise. And the thing is with glaciology, there's so many mysteries about glaciers that we still don't really know about. There's so many processes that happen inside them that we don't know exactly what's happening inside the glacier. And so that's what I'm studying is how water travels inside and under glaciers. And in order to understand exactly how fast the sea level is going to change, we need to try to understand all those little processes inside because that will help us predict how fast the sea level is going to rise. And why is it important to understand how fast the sea level is going to rise? That's so that people can plan. So there's still a huge amount of uncertainty about exactly how much sea level rise will happen. So we don't know how fast the sea level is going to rise, and we don't know how much it's going to, because we don't have a 100% understanding about how glaciers work. And so that's why we're trying to study them, because the difference between 10 meters of sea level rise and 100 meters of sea level rise is huge.
Mhm.
And if we know how much is going to happen, then we can plan. Like there's a lot of different ways that engineers can build, for example, seawalls to protect against climate change, or we can change the way that we implement government policy and ways that we can like guide people maybe don't live in this area of the country, maybe like start to move inland, um, and things like that, so we can really prepare for sea level rise. I think it's really important to understand glaciers better.
Yeah, it's the preparation and also the prevention part of climate change in general, because most of this is caused by the CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. So preventing that and being proactive about it will help keep these glaciers still frozen for centuries to come. And that's the main goal of this entire climate change problem. It's preventing these ice sheets and glaciers from melting. We still want our beaches, right? Because beach vacations are pretty cool. We don't want our coastlines to sink underwater, not have Miami anymore, because that's one of the very popular beach spots. So it's really cool to see how glaciers are impacting so many different things and so many aspects, coming from culture to countries to land, everything. It's just so awesome to see all this.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And it's yeah, it's sad to see places like Miami are starting to be more and more affected by things like storms as well.
Mhm.
As sea level is slowly rising, every time you have like a rise in storm surges, those storm surges are becoming more and more damaging to communities because the sea level is higher and you see more flooding near the coasts and so on.
Yeah, it's so much going on. And it's all on the next generation as well, because the next generation is going to take care of this planet. So, speaking of next generation, what advice do you have for kids who are interested in science?
Um, I would say just keep learning. I mean, I'll say one thing about myself when I was a kid is I thought that you had to be a certain way in order to be a scientist. I thought that you have to talk a certain way or you have to act a certain way or you have to uh I don't know, just you have to be like a crazy smart person. And I actually thought that me myself. Like I had a lot of doubt in myself about whether I was smart enough to be a scientist and to be a really good scientist. But I was lucky that I had people who kept encouraging me in my life, and I'm really grateful for them. And so my message is to people, if you ever feel doubtful of yourself, that if you feel like you're not smart enough or you feel like you can't be a scientist for whatever reason, anyone can be a scientist. And if you just keep working at it, you're not, it's not that you're not smart enough. You just got to keep working at it, and anyone can become a scientist. And then my other piece of advice would be to try and find someone who can really mentor you and encourage you. So for me, my environmental science teacher in high school was really important for encouraging me to get into science. And especially like with pursuing it, he really encouraged me to go for my dreams. So I guess to sum it up, yes, just you don't have to be a certain way or be a certain type of person in order to be a scientist. You could be anyone. And try not to doubt in yourself too much and find people who can encourage you because even if you doubt in yourself, you can still do it.
That's some really great advice. Anyone can become a scientist no matter what. They just need to have that mindset in order to question the world around them and have fun while doing it, which is what's the joy of science is all about. That's how I'm into science as well, as you can see. So thank you so much again for joining me today. I really enjoyed it. Learned so much about glaciers and climate change and all the impacts it has on us. And your really great advice definitely sticks with us. So thank you so much again for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Spectacular Science. Spectacular Science, produced and hosted by me, Akshay Raman. Our theme song additional music are by Chan Ramachandran. Special thanks to Neosha Narayanan for accepting my interview invite. I learned so much in this episode, and it's so mind-blowing to see all the science going on in glaciers and how that will affect our future. Please visit my podcast website, spectacularsci.com, to find interactive activities, articles, and blog posts. That's spectacularsci.com. Do you have a science question you want answered on a Spectacular Science episode and get a special shout out? Well, grab an adult and head over to spectacularsci.com/contact. There you can find a contact form and you can send me your amazing science questions. Thank you so much. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening right now. It really encourages me, and you'll be updated on all the new episodes. So subscribe and share this podcast with your friends and family. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Spectacular Science next week. Keep thinking about science.